there's some government agency, which one I don't know, I don't remember, that is starting to look into the practices of some of the consumer goods companies. And the reason is that these consumer goods companies did raise prices quite significantly using the pandemic and using the inflation as a reason for those price increases. Well, the pandemic is gone. Inflation is under control to some extent. And those companies are still raising prices at the same level. So what this government agency was about to start investigating is, are these companies gouging customers, right? And or are there maybe even collusion between companies to to raise prices of everything in a category.
Per Sjofors, also known as the Price Whisperer, is a thought leader and author in everything pricing and how companies can use pricing to drive higher growth, sales volume, and profits. He's a sought-after speaker for various conferences and gets routinely quoted in the financial and business press. We discussed the difference between business in Europe and the US, whether products and services are usually priced too high or too low, and how to justify increasing prices to your customers. Enjoy our conversation. Per, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, Daniel.
So here's where I want to start. You've run companies in both the US and Europe. I'm just curious, what are the main differences between us and how the Europeans conduct business?
I'll tell you what I experienced as the main difference is companies here in the US are very fear driven. and I think it's I think it really stems from the fact that it's a lot easier to fire people here in the US than it is in Europe. And this is something I encountered many times actually, that people here make decisions that may be good for them personally and specifically for their own safety, as opposed to make decisions for the betterment of the company.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one key difference that is negative for the US. A negative issue on the European side is that they don't have nearly as the same hurry, or they're not as focused on getting things done as quickly as we are here in the US.
Yep, you can't have it all.
This sense of urgency may be a better way of saying.
Got it. So definitely interesting differences there. But on one of the things that you just said, you said it was much harder to fire someone in Europe. What are the firing practices like in Europe? I'm assuming there's like much more legislation around that.
Well, just like here, there's a process where you have to you have to give people formal notice, and they have time to rectify and stuff like that. And then if you eventually end up firing somebody, you still have to pay them 6 or 12 months salary. I'm sure there are ways around it, but those are the sort of general terms that I'm aware of, or at least that's what it was when I lived and worked in Europe.
It's interesting. Well, I'll say this, from the employee perspective, it's great, but from the business owner perspective, definitely something we would rather have more US policies on. Definitely don't want to be crazy strict, want to make sure there's a due process, but 12 months severance, I mean, sounds like an insane price to pay from a business perspective. So stark differences there. So you're a pricing expert, and I want to get into a lot of really fun pricing questions. And I know early on in your career, you ran a lot of different pricing experiments. What were some of those experiments early on?
Oh, I mean, what we did, we tested different prices, and we tested different ways of displaying prices, and it was all done by by gut feel and so forth. And and by sheer luck, it sometimes worked really very well. And so we could see increases like next quarter revenues are up 25% or thereabouts, right? Most of the time, it did um, little change at all, um, and and then on a few occasions it ended up being complete duds. Just revenue tanked. you know, and and what I had learned of about pricing in business school was so academic and theoretical that it really didn't help us to understand why some of those experiments worked really very well and others didn't work at all. So, and it was that there's a lot of people, a lot of companies who do pricing experiments. The problem with pricing experiments is that it only looks at pricing as as would it live in a vacuum. It's you change your pricing in experimenting with different things, and it's in isolation, right? And everything you do in your company actually affects how you can price. So it's that to price correctly, a company needs to understand how that all of that everything affects how you can set prices.
So, speaking about some of those experiments, the ones that didn't work out, I know we can learn a lot from the successes because typically, we learn from the successes that our gut feeling is right, but we probably learn just as much, if not more, from the failures. So, what did you learn from the experiments that didn't do so well?
Well, what I learned was that really what I learned was that we could not find any rhyme or reasons why some experiments worked and others didn't. And because again, we saw at the time, just like other companies who are doing pricing experiments, we just looked at pricing in isolation, and that being the main issue here when it comes to good pricing practice.
Definitely. So you've also worked with, interestingly enough, thousands of different products across numerous industries. How does pricing strategy differ from industry to industry? I mean, is there some generic theme across all of business, or are there some unique insights across industries?
Um, that's a hard question.
Pick the right podcast today.
I'm sorry.
You picked the right podcast today.
Well, it's a hard question because the the process that I developed and that we use is all about taking that holistic view on how different aspects of a company's how they go to market, how they market themselves, what feature functions they promote, how they target their customers, and so forth. All of that affects how they can set prices. And so, why it's a hard question is that we don't look back; we look forward, right? And whatever the company did in the past is not so interesting. What is interesting is what's going to happen going forward. And but as I'm talking here, a couple of things comes to mind. One is that in many B2B sales or sales or pricing instances, the the issue often is that the company goes to market with essentially with the wrong strategy, i.e., they are focused on stratifying their prices in ways that is not the way that the buyers want to buy. And let me give you two examples, right? Um, one is a company that sells a particular service to companies where it's used in their recruitment process. Um, successful company, growing, profitable, all good stuff, right? And they're selling their services on a onesie twosie basis. So once a company is looking at recruiting somebody, um, or promoting somebody within the company, they buy one of these services, right? And they pay whatever they pay. That's not important for this particular conversation. Now, it turns out that there's only about 20% of buyers who want to buy this particular service on a one-on-one basis. They want to buy an annual subscription and get as many instances of this particular service as they want. So the company had a pricing strategy that served 20% of the market, foregoing 80% of the market,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, and and um, and this is quite common, right? Another example in B2B is um, a company selling a particular services to hospitals, right? And it's about integration and so forth of technology, and they are been selling this on a this is this is what we're going to do, and this is how much one of these integration projects are going to cost, right?
Mm-hmm.
But hospitals want to buy this on a per bed basis. You know, we have 80 beds, and because of that, our we see this as a cost per bed, and that will just by making that change, the company is going to double their addressable market.
So, speaking of that change, is a good way to summarize it would be that instead of the way that companies typically market, assuming B2B marketing, they're trying to sell an entire solution, they're selling something a little more micro and a little more customizable for their clients.
Yeah, it's not that so much, but it's more that the buyers look at what they're going to, in this particular case, they look at what they're going to buy on a pricing per bed as opposed to a complete, all you can eat kind of price. So they have a different perspective on how they want to buy.
So, why do sellers typically lead with that all you can eat kind of pricing instead of doing something on a per bed basis?
Um, the well, so here's what happens, and any company goes to market with a certain marketing message, a certain positioning statement, a certain way of doing business, right? And that will appeal to a portion of their marketplace. Now, if then the company goes back into asking their customers, why did you buy? What are you? What are the reasons? How do you want to buy? Why did you buy, and so forth? Those customers will just echo back what the company already said, because they then operate within an echo chamber, right? What's more important, actually, for a company is to ask those who didn't buy and say, why didn't you buy? Right? But that's not what many companies do. Many companies talk only to customers. Big mistake.
I like that strategy to find out from your customers why they didn't buy because I think that can be some of the most useful data points as you pivot your sales or pricing strategy.
And there's another point when you talk to customers, and that is that customers lie. You know, they
Hmm.
they um, they will say things that denigrate the actual value that they see with a company's product or service, because they want the company to
Lower
come
the
in
price.
with lower prices next time they buy, right?
Uh,
And
well,
sometimes they say things they think the company wants to hear.
well, unfortunately, I don't know if there's such a thing as the perfect customer, but hopefully that's not something that the audience or listeners deal with. On another note, we've spoken a lot about pricing on a high level here. Do you think most products or services are usually priced too high or too low?
Too low.
So can you expand
In
on that?
in in um, in I would say that our experience tells us that somewhere between 70 to 80% of products or services are priced too low. And the result, the reason for that is just that a company talks to customers, or if you have prices where they negotiate, then they believe that what the buyer is telling them and what the buyer is willing to pay is true, and it's not, right? And it's just negotiation tactics, and and um, and if you if you sell stuff sort of online, you look at a competitor and you say, "Oh, I've got to be the same price," or I got to be a little lower in price," or so forth. What you don't say, or what many companies don't say, is that how can I differentiate myself from my competitor in ways that allow me to set higher, more profitable prices without um, reducing my sales volume.
I like that. The idea of instead of telling, or talking about how big the market size is, like actually, I just saw a little bit before we got on the air, I saw a clip about Mark Cuban, and he says that whenever someone comes on Shark Tank and talks about how big the market size is, he automatically goes out. So I love the approach of instead of just addressing the total market, saying how, you add value or you differentiate yourself from your competitor, thereby adding more value to your customer. I really like that approach. But on that, I actually have a really interesting example that I wanted to bring up. So we're talking about pricing and how sometimes companies don't charge, a high enough price. How can brands build such loyalty, like such customer loyalty, that they can charge insane premiums? And two examples that come to mind are Louis Vuitton and Gucci. And I'm not sure what their financial statements look like, but I'm pretty sure that there's a significant markup on luxury clothes. So how can they pursue that pricing strategy and still make, the insane top line that
Well,
they do?
well, the price by itself is part of the exclusivity, right? Not everybody can afford, um, the prices that the luxury brands support, right? Uh, which means that the addressable market is pretty small. But but if they go to market with commodity like prices, they lost their whole brand identity, and they don't they're not exclusive anymore. So, and because of that, they just don't appeal to those that are willing to pay higher prices.
So, say for example, if there's a new entrant coming into the clothing market, hypothetically, do you think that they would have a higher chance of success, coming off as an affordable brand and pricing competitively, or trying to price themselves as a premium brand, even though they'll have a smaller market, yet make higher revenues? Which of those do you think might lead to the bigger chance of success?
It's more than that, because it depends on what resource you have to market yourself, right?
Hmm.
Um, if I mean if if you do that, if you happen to come up with some kind of unique clothing or design, and you happen to be good friends and neighbor with the Kardashians, you should probably have a luxury brand, right?
Hmm.
Um, if on the other hand, you have a factory in Vietnam that can stamp out these products in the millions, you probably should be a commodity brand. So
So,
it depends, right?
so to pursue the one that you're more familiar with and that you think you're just a little closer to that totally addressable market.
Yeah, and it's I mean, if you look at, I mean, these some of these luxury brands, um, they create some kind of mystique, right? And there's always a person there, you know. Um, I mean, there was a Louis Vuitton, yeah, right.
Mhm.
And whatever he did enable him to charge higher prices. But then again, the design of something like that surely lies only in the eye of the beholder, right? You cannot make a sort of a technical you cannot make a technical assessment that this luxury device is in any way better designed than this non-luxury device. It's all in the perceptions, right?
Values in the eye of the beholder for sure.
Yeah.
So we spoke earlier about how a lot of companies or services don't price high enough, other than pricing too high or too low. And I don't know if there's another answer besides, whether pricing too high or too low to this, but curious to hear your perspective. What do you think the biggest pricing mistake a company can make is?
Well, the most common pricing mistake um, is that people just guess what they're going to price. They just they pick a number out of thin air, right? And let me tell you a story about that. I maybe 5 years ago, so I was in had conversations with a SaaS company, and the CEO said, "Well, I decided to price our product at $160 per month per user." And then he continued, "But I don't know. Maybe it should have been 99. Maybe it should have been 250. But 160 just felt right." And this was a startup company, um, and I recently looked at their website, right? And it's the same website as from 5, 6 years ago. So they probably haven't grown that much.
So, if you could go back in time and give that owner advice, what would be the best piece of practical pricing advice you would have given him?
I would shake him up, you know, and I would say, I mean, most companies are data driven to in one way or another, right? And but but guessing and gut feel prevails when it comes to pricing. And I would say to this guy, don't you want your company to grow faster than competition? Don't you want to have more resource to market yourself than competition? Don't you want to have more resource to for more product development than competition,
There's
etc.?
There's actually a funny story. I remember hearing Jeff Bezos on Lex Friedman's podcast, and he spoke about customer service wait times, and his staff told him about the facts, how they were less than a minute, something along the lines of that, but that there were customer reviews saying, "Oh, we waited so long, we waited so long." So he said what they did was in that board meeting, they called up Amazon customer service, and sure enough, it was a few minutes until they got a hold of someone. So the big lesson he learned from that, and I think to tie it into what you were saying, is that when it's between a fact and an anecdote, usually the anecdote wins, and the anecdote comes from intuition. So
Yeah.
I think a great practical example there. And if you want to get ahead, you can't wait on all this data analysis. At some point, you have to take a chance and go with your gut.
Well, that's in yes and no. The Malcolm Gladwell have written a book about that on how gut feel prevails, and we do exactly the opposite, right? And that's why when it comes to pricing, it generates such spectacular results. I just to quote one client, who said that we helped them grow from 100 million to way over a billion, right? And over a few years, obviously, but that was because once you price for profit, you get much more resource for your market development.
I like that saying, to price for profit.
Yeah,
But speaking about pricing and knowing what your customers could pay, I actually saw a really interesting post you had on LinkedIn that I wanted to ask you about. So I believe it was one of Pear's or one of Pear's pricing tips. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly or if that's the right word that was
sure.
used, but in kind of the tip, you talk about customer personas and how they translate to sales. So when a company is thinking about how they want to price something, what can they do to find the right customer persona for their business?
Um, Well, they need to go and ask questions to the entire market, and the entire market is those who buy and those who don't buy, and people who don't know the company, and they need to do so in an anonymous way, because if you're not anonymous, people will lie,
Hmm.
and understand from those. If you do it by interviews, or if you do it online, that we do in my company, it still needs to be developing an understanding of what segment of the market would support higher, more profitable prices, right?
I think it's a really powerful phrase that if it's not anonymous, then people will lie. I think for whatever reason, people tend to tell the truth more to anonymous sources.
Well, yeah. Now, how do you make it anonymous? Well, you say we are doing market research on behalf of an industry, right? Here, you know, the association of butter fluffers manufacturers doing a study on why somebody want to buy a butter fluffer. You
That's a
know,
good. What is a butter fluffer, by the way?
it's something that fluffs your butter.
Oh, butter fluffer. Oh, to like I got it. Okay, interesting. I've never heard of one of those before, but you learn.
Well, you go to a restaurant and you have breakfast and they have fluffy butter. I don't know how you make it, but I guess it's a butter fluffer.
That's interesting. So you learn something new every day.
Yeah.
Um, on another note, I actually saw you had another post about self checkout, and I know this isn't so much focused on pricing, but I know a lot of self checkout like companies or grocery stores may look at this as a way to save money in the short run, but a lot of times it irritates customers because it's a very annoying process. The machine a lot of times tells you to put something back in the bag that you scanned, a whole long line of issues. So I'm just curious what your personal thoughts are about self checkout.
I try to avoid them. I mean, it was they were introduced what, maybe 12 years ago, 14 years ago, something like that.
Hmm.
Um, and initially they didn't work very well at all. They work a little bit better now, but the one thing is that of course it leads to a lot of theft, right? I mean, you don't need many brain cells to figure that out.
Hmm. Emphasis on a little better after so many years.
I'm sorry.
Is it emphasis on the fact that it works only a little bit better after so long? I mean, I do think that maybe there's capability for it to be better in the future, but right now it seems like a bit of a pain in the ass.
So what they do in Europe actually is that you don't have self checkout. You go and you grab one of these little like a scanner,
Hmm.
and as you put something into your bag or your um, uh, your cart,
Art.
you're supposed to scan it, and then you just walk out.
Love the Amazon model. It sounds like Europe was the real pioneer there. So
Yeah, well, there's an Amazon. There's actually a couple of Amazon stores close to me, and they just use regular checkouts.
love to see it. So to in regards to back on our pricing topic, you actually wrote an article in Forbes that I thought was really cool, and I wanted to tell you about something that I thought was interesting and see your thoughts on it. So you had the article where you discussed the importance of pricing, and speaking about pricing, one of the things that you spoke about was elasticity. So for those
Hmm.
that don't know, elasticity is basically how sensitive a product is to a pricing change. So for example, if a price goes really high up and the demand for product doesn't change, then the demand for the product is inelastic. But if there's a significant price change and the demand goes significant price change that goes up and the demand contracts, then the demand is very elastic. And I like that you're shaking your head. It sounds like I remember something from high school economics, so I
Yes.
totally didn't forget my education. So before I get into kind of another specific thing I wanted to ask about that, how can a company determine the elasticity of its product?
Well, they shouldn't test. Just like I said, because um, testing is what we did. This is what we started to talk about, right? And testing um, just sees pricing in isolation, and pricing does not live in isolation.
Mhm.
If you want to test, think about this. Say that you start with maybe 8 different pricing messages,
Hmm.
times 6 different marketing messages, times 3 different marketing channels, times focuses on 6 different product features or functions, times maybe 3 different sales channels, maybe 3 different payment options, times six different stratification,
Becomes
and you
exponential.
end up with 35,000 different combinations,
Hmm.
right? And it's just impractical to test.
Okay, so it would be a good way to, instead of coming up with this crazy big testing strategy, just to kind of, I don't want to say sporadically, but to test out some strategy, see how it works, and then, and when I say that strategy, I don't mean to do all the planning, but to kind of test it with a test group, see how that responds, then slowly scale up, and then once you have a good idea, then you can really go forth with your go to market.
Yeah,
Would that be a better
it's
approach?
about understanding, and you've obviously read up on me, so you know that I'm talking a lot about having that holistic view,
Hmm.
and it's that holistic view that makes all the difference,
So,
and really understanding that that everything you do in the company. And how do you get? I mean, what we do in my company is that we do this through a particular kind of online pricing research, where we go out to a company's market and we find out how all of this affects how you can price. If that is not an option, the um, the way to do it is to really have interviews with non-customers,
mhm.
not with customers, with non-customers, because those are the ones that you want to know how you can reach.
And to get their unbiased opinion too, since they don't have kind of an interest or conflict of interest in purchasing your product for cheap.
That's right. Yeah, that's very true.
So, for example, if a product is inelastic, so there's significant demand for it regardless of price, if a company sees this and understands this and thinks, okay, we can raise our price to make much more money, it doesn't matter, the demand is the same. Obviously, when you do that, you could have some negative PR. So, just from a public relations perspective, how can a company, address a price increase like that for something that's inelastic, that would potentially, that would potentially anger customers?
Um, well, price increases is always they're not difficult, but they first of all, if it's a small increase, um, a company should just do it. Nobody cares if something goes up 3% or something.
You can
Well,
always blame the government and inflation for 3 or
yeah,
4%.
exactly. You
Just
can
keep
do that. But if you're talking about more significant price increases, it could be done by coming out with a new product version, or it could be by focusing on a different um, on a different customer category, or what consumer goods companies often do. They what the shrinkflation is, right?
Mhm.
You start selling this, you keep the price, and you get less for the money, right?
16 ounces instead of 20.
Which is a really sneaky way, I think.
Mhm.
but but having said that, it's been it's a well established practice.
Process.
But again, let's say that you're in a, like you say, in an inelastic market, and you want to increase prices. What you do is that you come up with a, a, a similar product in the same category at a higher price, and you may want to limit your original product a little bit, so that you end up with a sort of a good, better, best strategy, right? Where the better and the best are more um, are higher priced options.
So you don't just adjust the price or raise the price out of the blue. You have to come up with, at least on paper, a fair justification for doing
Yeah,
so.
absolutely, and it has to be a justification that makes sense to the customer, not you. I mean,
Definitely.
and and you don't want to do a price increase 3 days after the local paper had run a big big article about the CEO's new yacht, right?
Mhm. It's a good point.
Yeah,
So, do you think a great pricing is more art or science?
it's science. It's not
So, how
art at
about
all.
this? Well, it's would you say it has an aspect of art to it as well?
No, no,
All
it doesn't.
science.
It's all science, and it's all behavioral science.
Mhm,
It's it's behavioral science and behavioral economics, and um, it leverages the work of three Nobel Prize winners,
mhm,
um, Simon, Kahneman, and Thaler, right?
mhm,
Who all have done uh, very significant research into how we as humans make purchase decisions,
mhm.
and well, decisions in general, but for the purpose of pricing purchase decisions. And by understanding how imprecise those decisions are, and how how the seller can um, um, quote unquote manipulate the buyer, not only so that the buyer becomes more satisfied with the purchase at the same time as the prices are higher, right? And that is something that again is generated from a detailed understanding of that whole decision landscape that sits in here, right? And makes us want to buy or not want to buy.
Interesting. So, I always thought that a lot of this stuff was art and science, probably more science, but I always thought that the art came. Sorry, I thought it was more art than science, but in my head, I always thought the science came first. So, really interesting to hear that perspective, and appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah, well,
You know, another hot topic these days is AI, and
mhm.
I'm sure you hear about AI probably every, few hours, and in every news article it seems like generative AI is just the new hot word these days. How can we use AI, or how can companies use AI to help them better price products?
um, we use AI in my company because we create a tremendous amount of data in these projects that we do. I mean, I said when we talked about how to do testing and everything affects how you can price. I mean, that creates a lot of data.
Mhm.
And in order to drill down into that data, AI can be very useful.
So,
But AI, if it's not used properly, um, creates something of no value, right?
so how can we use it properly to ensure that it's a valuable experience?
Um, it needs to be, as far as at least as far as I know, it needs to. AI needs to have very strict boundaries on what it can do and cannot do, right? And and it needs to um, it you something that I've learned is that you cannot just feed AI data and expect to get a reasonable response if you want. You have to have people who know how to use the AI um, uh, and drill deeper and deeper into um, the essentially ask AI um, to elaborate and drill deeper into its own algorithms, right?
And to have good data as well, probably, because your output's
Yeah,
probably
of course. Yeah, that goes
as
without
good as your
saying.
input.
But
So,
AI, I don't know if you know this, but you probably do. But AI was first conceptualized in 1951 by
interesting.
a guy
So,
called Alan Turing.
what was his vision for AI?
No, he came up with the whole idea that you can actually have software that learns from its own operation. and it was then called machine learning. And the term AI was coined in 1957.
It's
But
interesting.
it was still called machine learning up until maybe 20 years ago,
Isn't it kind of
maybe
crazy to
15
see
years
just
ago.
the trajectory in the past, 2 or 3 years as compared to the 70 before that?
Yeah.
So what exponential growth looks like. Crazy to see that, but
Yeah, but AI is not new. This is what I'm trying to say. What's new is that
the
um,
capabilities.
there's the computing power is much higher, of course, and developers have had, like you said, 70 years to write better algorithms.
Definitely. On a parting note here, and we've spoken a lot about pricing and some of the mistakes that companies can make and some of the best pricing tips that you have. But looking ahead, what's the future of pricing strategy look like?
Well, I think it's interesting that there was I read the other day that there's some government agency, which one I don't know, I don't remember, that is starting to look into the practices of some of the consumer goods companies. And the reason is that these consumer goods companies did raise prices quite significantly using the pandemic and using the inflation as a reason for those price increases. Well, the pandemic is gone, inflation is under control to some extent, and those companies are still raising prices at the same level. So what this government agency was about to start investigating is, are these companies gouging customers, right? And or are there maybe even collusion between customers, right, or between companies to um, to raise prices of everything in a category, right?
It's interesting. I'll have to keep my eye out to see what happens with that. But interesting dynamics on both sides, whether it's the business side or the consumer side. But if it comes out that there was foul play, uh, you know, I will be interesting to see what happens with those companies' earnings, to say the least. We'll put it on
Yeah,
that.
that's right. And the whole point that's from this government agency was that um, they 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 said in this article I read that should they really have such big, substantial profits?
Well, if nefarious intent is found, I fear for those earnings. So we'll keep an eye on that. But it's been an absolute blast. Thanks so much for sharing all the pricing knowledge that you have, and thanks for coming on the podcast.
Well, thank you very much, Daniel, and I hope this was interesting also for the audience.
Thank you for listening to my conversation with Per Sjofors. If you enjoyed the episode, rate the show on Spotify, drop a comment on YouTube, and subscribe.